All right, so we have here Professor Lawrence Marshall. He's a professor of law right here at the Stanford Law School, and the Associate Dean for Clinical Education, and the David and Stephanie Mills Director of the Mills Legal Clinic. He received his JD from Northwestern University School of Law in 1985, and then clerked for 2 years, first at the DC Circuit Court and then at the Supreme Court with Justice John Paul Stevens, which, if you're interested in law school, that's like the holy grail. Afterwards, he was a professor of law at Northwestern University before joining the Stanford faculty in 2005. Throughout his career, Professor Marshall has been a world-renowned voice in discussions of the U.S. criminal justice system, not just as an academic, but also as a reformer and an activist. For example, he co-founded and served as legal director of the world-renowned Center on Wrongful Convictions while he was at Northwestern. Today, Professor Marshall is here to talk about a different aspect of the U.S. criminal justice system, the death penalty. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I've heard about this program since I've arrived at Stanford and haven't yet had a chance to participate either as a speaker or an audience member, although perhaps if the speaker is good today, I'll choose to come later and be part of the audience. We'll see. The subject of the death penalty is a very timely one. As some of you may know, California is gearing up to have the question of the continuation of the death penalty on the ballot this November. California adopted the death penalty through citizen initiative back in 1978, and therefore the only way it can do away with it is also through citizen initiative. That's a very unique aspect of California politics, which raises a whole set of its own ethical issues. Particularly, interestingly, you would think that a citizen initiative is something that's much more popular in a way and has less interference with access to public opinion than going derivatively through a legislature. But in reality, interestingly, the cost of getting on the ballot in California is itself $2 million in signature gathering. You pay for signature gathering. Nobody can really do it at a grassroots level. So you have to pay all those people who stand at the supermarkets. And then the estimate for how much it costs to do the advertising around one of these is in the range of $7 or $8 million. So you're looking really at a $10 million budget to get something on the ballot. And interestingly, when you're looking at going to the legislature on some issue, we all know about the pay-to-play aspect of politics and access, but the reality is there have been many measures that do get through the legislature based on their own equities and morality and ethical dimensions. So it's an anomalous situation that the direct representation, or I should say the direct electoral involvement, can actually be something that necessarily involves a lot of money, while having access to legislators can be done sometimes on certain issues without that money. So it's an interesting point, not specifically what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is three particular ethical dimensions, sort of many, that deal less with the merits of the death penalty as an ethical matter, and more with issues that arise around the campaign and my personal involvement in the death penalty. Although one of them, the middle one, does get more to the heart of some of the death penalty debate. So I'd like to quickly sketch on an autobiographical level my own involvement in this issue, and then talk about these three issues, and then raise questions. I have no answers to these, and then really engage in conversation around these issues or others that may interest you. So I started off as an academic with zero interest in the death penalty and very little interest, frankly, in criminal justice. As was mentioned, I had clerked at the Supreme Court and had been exposed for the first time to a lot of death penalty work. At that time, in the mid-1980s, the death penalty was quite active in the United States. It was, in fact, the heyday of the modern death penalty. There were numbers of death sentences in the country were over 300 a year. Contrast that to today, where there's been a sharp, sharp decrease in the numbers of death sentences being imposed, generally around 100 a year for the past several years. Talk a little bit about why that's come about. And indeed, there's been a significant diminution in support for the death penalty nationally and a trend toward abolition in many states. Most recently, this week, a day and a half ago, Connecticut Senate voted to abolish the death penalty in that state, and that's expected to go through the other branch of the legislature and to be signed by the governor. In that sense, Connecticut will be joining the ranks of states such as New Jersey, New York, New Mexico, Illinois, that have in fact abolished the death penalty in the past several years. So there is a lot of momentum in that regard. And I think my own, again, autobiographical involvement is a metaphor for what's happened nationally on some of those issues. So my exposure, as I said, had been during my clerkship, and particularly poignant had been a case called Mccleskey versus Kemp. Mccleskey had been the case that threatened the death penalty, the last great threat in the judicial branch toward the death penalty, and what it had been based on was the fact that notwithstanding efforts to try to regularize and remove arbitrariness with death sentences that had emerged in the 1970s, studies had repeatedly shown that there was one cancer on the death penalty system that seemed irremediable, and that was the cancer of racism. That the studies had been done in various states, particularly in Georgia in that case, arising out of Georgia, which showed that race was having a tremendously significant impact on who was sentenced to death and who was not. Now, interestingly, when you hear that, my guess is, if you haven't studied the subject, that you're assuming that when I say race, I mean that African American defendants, Latino defendants, were more likely to receive sentences of death than white defendants. And that was true a little bit. But what was way more significant than that was actually the race of the victim. That if you kill a white person in the United States, that is likely to trigger the kind of uproar, the kind of upset, the kind of intense passion. It gets you onto Nancy Grace, big time, in ways that stirred the system towards seeking the imposition of the death penalty, because the imposition of the death penalty is very resource heavy. It costs a lot of money. This is one of the great insights and one of the great surprises to people who learn that actually the death penalty is far more costly than is the option of life without parole. And that's, of course, very counterintuitive. Well, what do you mean keeping someone in prison for 40, 50, 60 years is cheaper than a death penalty? But when you study the issue, and every study has recognized this, when you study the issue and you look at the amount of judicial resources, the amount of defense lawyer resources, the amount of prosecutorial resources, the higher cost of housing someone on death row, the fact is you're paying millions of dollars more for every death sentence than you would for life without parole. And that's going to be a very significant aspect of this new campaign to abolish the death penalty. To say, amidst this economic crunch, can we really afford, even if you believe in the death penalty as an ethical matter, is it something that can be afforded? Does it give us as much value as using that money in various other ways, whether it's in public safety, whether it's in education, whether it's in helping victims of violent crimes? Is the death penalty really the wisest place to be spending the money? But back for a second to my own story in Mccleskey versus Kemp, the studies showed the impact of race, and yet the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, said, look, what are we going to do? There's some aspect of racism that is endemic to America. It's endemic to the criminal justice system. The court said if we really tried to purge the impact of racism, we would have to abolish the criminal justice system in its entirety, because clearly it's ubiquitous across criminal justice. People are getting sentences that are longer based on race. Should we let everybody out of prison, the court asked? So ultimately the court said there's just no way to try to purge. We can try, but no way to purge the impact of race. Ergo, we have to live with some racism. Ergo, this is not an indictment that is going to lead to the abolition or restriction of the death penalty. And the dissenters, pardon the reference, but screamed bloody murder. And they said, well, wait a minute, of course we could do away with the death penalty, because unlike the idea of doing away with prisons or doing away with prisons based on race, which would lead to chaos, we could, of course, have a criminal justice system that doesn't have a death penalty, and if the option is having a racist death penalty or no death penalty, the death penalty is expendable. Witness all of the states in the US that proceed without the death penalty. Witness all of Europe, which proceeds without the death penalty. Witness virtually all of South America and Central America. So it's not as if this is chaos or order. This is this particular issue of death penalty versus life without parole. So that was my introduction, and it certainly began to raise serious doubts in my mind about the justice of the death penalty, at least from that particular perspective. And of course, dealing with death on a first-hand basis, having cases that are before the court and you're running around the hallway trying to see if there are 5 justices who will stay the execution, and then getting the votes in, and there's not those 5 votes, and turning on the radio and learning that 15 minutes after the clerk of the court was given that result, the execution went forward, creates a very direct relationship with the death penalty that at least I found to be quite sobering, but not that it affected my career. So I went over to Northwestern after my clerkship, and I began doing very abstract legal analysis of constitutional law and sovereign immunity and statutory interpretation and things that I promise if I spoke about for even 1 second more, you'd all be asleep. But I was also doing some appellate work, and one day, serendipitously, someone approached me and said, hey, are you interested in taking on this death penalty case on appeal? And I said, what are you talking about? I'm trying to get tenure, I'm an associate professor, all these articles, I'm moonlighting to try to make a little money. No way. And they said, well, you may want to look at this case carefully. You may want to look at it carefully because it's pretty unique. The guy seems to be innocent. So I looked at the case over a weekend. They needed a pretty quick decision. For what it's worth, and the story obviously has an ethical dimension at a deep level. For what it's worth, that happened to be the weekend of the Jewish holiday Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur is the day where you're deciding who should live and who should die. You're not deciding, but you're reflecting on, you know, the idea that God decides on that, who should live and who should die. And I was trying to decide whether to take this case involving whether someone will live or someone will die, and had this epiphany on a personal, ethical level, if you will, religious level, that there's this prayer that one says as the climax of the ritual of Yom Kippur that says that, you know, on this day it's decided who by fire, who by water, who by stoning. It goes through all methods of death. And then it says, however, through repentance and prayer and acts of justice, one can mitigate the decree. And I had always understood that in a very simplistic way, sort of this idea of God as a puppet master who's pulling strings and that we're begging God to change the decree. But on that day, as I was deciding whether to take this case, I had a very different view of it, which is that our acts of repentance and prayer, which then stimulate us toward involving ourselves in acts of justice, mitigate the decree because we mitigate the decree through our own actions, because we get involved and can have an impact. And when I had that epiphany, it wasn't a born-again moment per se, but when I had that epiphany, it was like, okay, I need to take that case. So I took the case, thinking it would be a few months of my life, and I'd write the appeal, and it turned out to be life-changing. It took over 5 years before we were able to secure his release. as an innocent man. We brought him a new trial. He was acquitted at that new trial. Ultimately, actually, his accusers, police officers and prosecutors, were criminally indicted for what they had done in trying to secure his conviction and death sentence, which they had succeeded twice at doing. But through that prism of wrongful convictions, I became a death penalty lawyer, which leads to the first of the ethical dilemmas that I want to point out. I was at a cocktail party, and this was, I should say, a very high-profile case in Illinois. It was the highest-profile case in Illinois death penalty history. It was of national significance. I went on 60 Minutes. I went on Nightline. The whole country was watching this case, and I had become totally immersed in it for all those years. And I was at a cocktail party one night, and a fellow came up and he said, you know, I know who you are. I've seen you on TV talking about this case. Introduced himself as a surgeon. He said, I'm curious, I've been thinking about this. How many hours have you spent on this one case? I said, I've never really thought about it. I'm not billing my time. He said, well, think about it for a second. Just try to estimate. So I looked back. This was maybe in year 4 of the representation, and I can't tell you how intense it had been. And I said, well, you know, at least 4,000 hours, at least 1,000 hours a year, given the legal stuff and the media and the political campaign that surrounded it. And he said, you're an idiot. He said, I'm a surgeon. What would it mean if I spent 4,000 hours at an operating table trying to save a single patient? Do you not know the meaning of the word triage? That if a client or a patient needs 4,000 hours of hands-on care, and that's just my time, forget about the team of other lawyers, then tragically that's a client who just can't be saved. We can't afford it as a society to spend that kind of time. And think of the opportunity cost. Think of all the other injustices you could have been confronting, you could have been dealing with. Think of the fact that you could have gone to a law firm and billed out at $500 at least an hour at that time in my career, times 4,000 hours. I can't even do the math. How much is that? 4,000 times 5, is it 2 million? No more, 2 million, right? Yeah. $2 million. How much good could you have done with those $2 million? How many lives could you have saved? What right do you have, he challenged me, to spend that on one particular client? Well, that was quite a moment, because here I thought I had been doing something reasonably righteous, and he's telling me that I've been involved in this gross injustice, a waste of human resources in a very dramatic way, that I had cost a lot of people their lives by not putting my resources elsewhere. Now, you know, I really struggled with this, and you know, I went back to something that turns out to be both in Jewish tradition and in Muslim tradition and Christian tradition, and that is the adage that one who saves a single life saves an entire world. But that wasn't entirely satisfying, because, of course, if I had used those resources to save 1,000 lives, I would have saved 1,000 entire worlds. So that didn't exactly resonate, and I took, ultimately it led me to say that it was critical to use this case, and by that time others that I had become involved in, as a vehicle for broader social transformation, for broader reflection and education on the death penalty and on criminal justice more generally. And that was actually the birth of the Wrongful Conviction Center. And it was the birth, really, of the use of wrongful convictions as an argument on the death penalty. I hosted a conference at Northwestern where we brought, for the first time ever, a significant group, over 30 individuals who had been on death row and who had later been found innocent, together on a stage with the idea that this was an issue that could really begin to change people's minds about the death penalty, that there was 20% of the public that was against the death penalty on ethical and moral principles in the abstract, over whether anyone has the right to take a particular life other than in immediate self-defense and the like. And that was based on philosophy and ethics and religion and the like, but that wasn't enough to really lead to any change in public policy. But there seemed to be another group that was amenable to becoming what I call pragmatic abolitionists. And that is to say that maybe in spirit I could believe in the death penalty, but given the practical realities around it, particularly the risk of executing the innocent, I can't get on that bandwagon. So that's one way I dealt with the triage question, but it's plagued me ever since, both with respect to the death penalty, but also with respect to each of our missions in life. And at what point do we have moral imperatives to ask whether we are using our energies in ways that help the most people possible and that tackle the largest amount of injustice that we can possibly tackle. In the meantime, on a personal level, through this case and through engagement on the death penalty, I had certainly become not only a pragmatic abolitionist, but ultimately an ethical abolitionist as well, just coming to believe that we just don't have the power or the right to kill, that perhaps certain people were entitled or deserving to die, but we weren't deserving to kill. And ultimately, in struggling with that, I began to struggle with a second set of ethical dilemmas as well. And that was the argument that was being put out there that the death penalty deters a significant amount of murder. And the issue had been raised, I think, as a relatively hypothetical matter because the studies really haven't borne it out. And as I'll talk about in a second, it doesn't really resonate with my reality. But still, as a hypothetical matter, the question was, if we could prove that for every execution, for every person we kill, we are saving a larger number of innocent lives because we're deterring murders, what would that do to the ethical case against the death penalty? Would it be ethical and reasonable for us, knowing that we could save a lot of innocent lives, to refrain from engaging in executions because it felt uncomfortable to us? Or is the moral, ethical imperative to create public policies that will save as many innocent lives as possible, even if that means having to engage sometimes in executions? That remains somewhat of a struggle to me, frankly, as an ethical matter. I've been able to avoid that ethical problem because I've become relatively certain of two things, more one than the other. I'm relatively certain that the death penalty simply does not deter. I cannot fathom the idea that there is a class of people out there who, in deciding whether to commit a murder, are saying to themselves, I will not commit that murder because I might get death. But knowing that what I'm going to get is life without parole, where I will be in a small cell until I die, a cell where I can reach out and touch the edges on both sides, where I can be deprived of almost all aspects of human liberty, that's not enough to deter me. Sure, I'm willing to commit the murder if that's all that's going to happen to me, but not death. That's going to be what deters me. I just don't believe that anyone who's calculating enough to where they're thinking about what might happen to them is going to find that marginal increase in sentence the thing that deters them when life without parole would not. Secondly, given my experience with people on death row, guilty people on death row, I know that the people who are on death row are almost invariably people with mental deficiencies or people who committed the crime in moments of intoxication or drug use or such passion that they weren't calculating. They weren't thinking methodically about, well, what might the sentence be if I do that? That they were either in a moment where they were sure, delusionally, that they would never get caught, or they were in this hellfire moment where they didn't give a damn what happened to them, that they were willing to do it no matter what. So I just don't buy it. And again, the studies that have been done have, for the most part, not universally, but for the most part, failed to see a deterrent impact on the death penalty. So I've become pretty sure of that, but I've become even more sure of the proposition that even if there are studies that do show, and one study claimed an 18-to-1 ratio of deterrence. One study claimed that for every execution we save 18 innocent lives. Again, I don't believe that, and far more studies have debunked that than have that have supported it. But even so, my conclusion is if we're going to defend the death penalty on the grounds of deterrence, the burden of proof would be on those who claim that deterrence function, and the burden of proof would be proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That just as on an individual's guilt or an individual's amenability to the sentence of death, we demand that proof, we should demand no less as a systemic matter, as a matter of public policy. So unless those advocating that claim could prove that and support that beyond a reasonable doubt, I don't believe it's a plausible defense of the death penalty, but I know that's a very legalistic kind of argument and may or may not be persuasive, and I continue to wrestle, at least in the abstract, with what if. Hasn't affected my behavior, but it is an intellectually, I think, ethically interesting question. A third question that's plagued me personally in a much more real way, and I think plagues the anti-death penalty community, or at least should, in a significant way, is the fact that the major antidote, if that's the right word, or major alternative out there to the death penalty, the most persuasive thing you can tell people, whether it's a jury or whether it's the public, in the case of Illinois, the legislature, in the case of California, the populace, the most powerful argument you can make is we don't need the death penalty to protect society because we have the option of life without parole. See, it used to be that wasn't even an option as a sentencing matter, and it used to be that the public believed that if we sentenced someone to something other than death, if we gave them life in prison, it would only be 10 or 15 or 20 years before they were out. That would pose a grave threat to public safety, and therefore that was a justification for imposing the sentence of death. Right now, however, for the past decade or two, every jurisdiction has in place a sentence of life without parole, where the only way someone will get out is realistically if they are in fact proven to be innocent, and of course that's happened now in over 140 cases since the modern advent of the death penalty in the late 1970s. So anti-death penalty advocates have become the great proponents of life without parole, interestingly. In Texas, which was one of the last states to adopt life without parole, and a great paradox, it was the prosecutors who resisted it, because they knew that with the option of life without parole, more and more juries would decline to impose death and would impose that life without parole sentence. And it was the death penalty proponents, otherwise those who you advocate with the left, who claim to be these folks who want more reasonable, sensible criminal justice sentences across the board. There is a group of people out there, a strong group of people, for whom the only issue in criminal justice and heavy sentences is death. You know, people who often come from a rather conservative religious vantage point in their attitudes on death. For example, the Catholic Church has been very strong on an anti-death penalty view, on a consistent theory of life, and it's consistent with issues around abortion for them. That the policy of life begins at conception and ends at natural death, and the death penalty isn't therefore excusable, and that's been a strong force in the anti-death penalty movement. And some of them are not otherwise, some are otherwise engaged in sort of looking at sentencing, but some don't really care about it other than that issue around the value of life. But certainly, you know, the criminal defense community that cares deeply around outrageous sentencing generally is a very strange group to be the major advocates of a sentence of life without parole, which many in the world and many in the United States look at as a horrifying abuse of human dignity and human rights. that the idea that you would throw someone in prison, often based on a crime that they committed in their late teens, or even right now the Supreme Court's deciding whether it's constitutional to put a 14-year-old in life without parole. That will be decided by this June. Many people believe as an ethical matter that that's an immoral sentence, which raises this third question, which is trading injustices. What do you do about the fact that the best way to save a few hundred people a year through abolishing the death penalty, or at least reducing the imposition, requires de facto supporting a measure of life without parole which implicates tens of thousands of people a year? How do you trade the gravity of those injustices? Do you say that, look, I'm unwilling to sacrifice those 10,000 people in favor of saving these few hundred? Or do you say this is a matter of timing, that first you take on the death penalty, get that off the books, so that clock is no longer ticking, and then you can challenge other things? But boy, that sounds a lot like a bait and switch, which raises its own ethical dimensions. What does it mean to go out there into the public and say to people that the reason we don't need a death penalty is life without parole, and then once you get rid of the death penalty, turn around and say, okay, the next thing to tackle is life without parole? And we went through that in Illinois. In Illinois, we had a strong component of people supporting abolition, people from the victims community, people who lost loved ones to murder, on the ground that we were saying life without parole will make you safe. And then once the death penalty was abolished, there was a group of folks, some of whom had been, many of whom, if not all of whom, had been advocates of abolition, who now turned around and said, let's take on the next behemoth. Let's take on life without parole. And people in the victims community were outraged. They felt they had been played in ways that were highly unethical. Raises fascinating dimensions. So both on the substance of how you measure those comparative injustices, and whether it's ever legitimate to advocate for something unjust because you believe that by doing that you're perhaps tackling a graver injustice, if in fact the death penalty is a graver injustice, and also what you do about public advocacy, and is there an excuse for hiding the ball, or at least for not adhering to promises that you've made in the public sphere. So I have taken for granted, although I shouldn't for sure, that there are compelling ethical arguments around abolition that most of you are familiar with, and we can certainly talk about in the conversation. That's sort of been an underlying theme. And instead I've chosen to focus on some particular ethical dilemmas that have affected, I think, both me and others who have been engaged in this battle to secure abolition.